The hall of the United Nations trembled with a silence so heavy it felt alive. Cameras clicked. Delegates whispered. And then, from across the marble floor, the sharp voice of Benjamin Netanyahu shattered the air. "You defend terrorists," he shouted, pointing toward the young Burkinabe president. The words echoed, bouncing off the glass walls of the assembly like a slap to the face of diplomacy. Ibrahim Traoré didn't move. His hands remained folded before him, his gaze steady, his presence unshaken. For months, the tension between Israel and much of the global south had been boiling. Gaza burned nightly, and every screen in the world showed the same images: smoke, rubble, and children being carried out of ruins. When Traoré condemned the bombings in a fiery speech the week before, Netanyahu had dismissed him as a soldier pretending to be a politician. But now they were in the same room, and the entire world was watching. Traoré raised his eyes slowly, not toward Netanyahu, but toward the hundreds of representatives seated before him. His voice, when it came, was calm in a way that scared his opponents more than rage ever could. "You bomb children," he replied. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried, every syllable cutting through the air like a blade. The cameras froze. Even translators hesitated before speaking. The clash wasn't just between two men. It was between two worlds, one built on centuries of dominance, and another awakening to its own power. Netanyahu's face tightened. "We are defending our people," he shot back, leaning over the microphone. "From monsters who hide behind civilians." Traoré stepped forward, the Burkinabe flag behind him catching the light. "And who defends the civilians from you?" he asked. Gasps spread through the hall. The question wasn't diplomatic, it was moral, and it hit like a thunderclap. In that moment, something shifted. Delegates from Africa, Latin America, and Asia, usually silent during such exchanges, began to murmur. The old order, where certain voices spoke and others stayed quiet, was cracking. As the camera zoomed in on the two men, one a veteran of endless wars, the other a soldier who had turned his rebellion into leadership, it was clear this wasn't just an argument. It was a reckoning. The moment Netanyahu's words faded, the room seemed to inhale and hold its breath. Diplomats exchanged uneasy looks. Reporters scrambled to capture every second of the confrontation. The tension was raw, electric, almost primal, the kind of silence that precedes history. Netanyahu straightened his suit and smiled thinly, the way a man does when he feels cornered but refuses to show it. "You lecture us about morality," he sneered, "while your own nations depend on our aid and our technology. Without the West, what are you?" It was meant to humiliate, but Traoré didn't flinch. He tilted his head slightly, as if studying a child throwing a tantrum. "Without the West," he replied, his voice calm but resonant, "we are still human. Without humanity, what are you?" His words landed like the report of a gunshot. Several delegates gasped. Some smiled discreetly. Others sat frozen, unwilling to move in fear of being seen taking sides. Netanyahu leaned closer to his microphone, his tone hardening. "You defend murderers. You stand with those who fire rockets at civilians." His voice rose, sharp and theatrical, crafted for headlines. "Tell me, President Traoré, how many of your allies have condemned Hamas? How many have condemned terror?" Traoré let the question hang in the air, refusing to rush. Then he spoke, slowly, deliberately, his words almost whisper-soft, which somehow made them louder. "Tell me, Prime Minister, how many of your bombs have landed on hospitals? How many on schools? How many on sleeping children?" A tremor ran through the hall. Cameras zoomed in on Netanyahu's face. His expression hardened, but his eyes flickered, just once, betraying something between irritation and uncertainty. Traoré continued, "You speak of defense. But every child buried under your rubble speaks of revenge. Every mother you silence gives birth to resistance. You call them terrorists. I call them the voices your missiles could not kill." It wasn't just rhetoric. It was defiance wrapped in truth, delivered with surgical precision. The hall was no longer an assembly of nations, it had become a courtroom, and Netanyahu stood accused before the conscience of the world. Traoré took a step back, his calm returning like the steady beat of a war drum. The difference between us, he said quietly, is that I fight to free my people. You fight to bury yours in fear. The audience erupted, not in applause, but in the kind of murmur that signaled a turning tide. The old world order had just been challenged by a young soldier from Africa, and everyone knew it. For several seconds after Traoré's final words, the Grand UN chamber was utterly still, not even the air conditioners dared to hum. Netanyahu's lips parted slightly, but no words came. He wasn't used to being challenged this way, not here, not by someone who didn't belong to his circle of power. Cameras flashed. The world's media smelled blood. Then, like the low rumble of distant thunder, whispers began to ripple through the hall. Delegates leaned toward each other, translators murmured behind glass booths, and the air thickened with a strange mix of disbelief and awe. The African bloc sat taller. Representatives from Latin America exchanged approving nods. Even some European diplomats, their expressions carefully neutral, avoided Netanyahu's eyes. They had just witnessed a fracture in the unspoken hierarchy of global politics. Netanyahu finally spoke, quieter now, his tone more calculated. You speak of morality, yet your nation struggles to feed its own people. You have no authority to judge Israel. It was an old tactic. Discredit the messenger, not the message. But Traoré only smiled faintly, as if he had expected this. Yes, he said, my nation is small, poor, even. But we do not use our poverty as an excuse to destroy others. We rebuild with our own hands, not with the ruins of another people. Gasps filled the chamber. Netanyahu's jaw tightened, and for a fleeting moment, his carefully rehearsed composure cracked. You think you can shame me? He snapped. You have no idea what it takes to survive surrounded by enemies. Traoré's reply came like thunder rolling over the savannah. Then maybe it is not the world that surrounds you, Prime Minister. Maybe it is the walls you built yourself. Those words landed harder than any insult. It was not anger that carried them, but truth, calm, heavy, irrefutable. Every camera in the room locked onto Traoré. The African president stood perfectly still, his face illuminated by the pale UN lights. Behind him, the Burkinabe flag shimmered softly, its red and green colors almost glowing against the sterile white marble. For the first time, Netanyahu looked tired, not defeated, but aged. The years of conflict, the endless justifications, the burden of violence, they all seemed to weigh on him at once. The chair of the session finally intervened, her voice trembling slightly. Gentlemen, she said, we remind all delegates to maintain diplomatic language. But the words were pointless. Everyone knew diplomacy had already left the room. Traoré nodded respectfully, then turned to the chair. Madam, he said softly, truth needs no diplomacy. The cameras caught it. That single line. Within minutes, it was already spreading across the world. By the time the session ended, the world had already chosen sides. News outlets around the globe cut their regular programming to replay the moment Traoré said, truth needs no diplomacy. Millions watched in silence as Netanyahu's face hardened, realizing that the narrative had slipped from his control. The clip trended within an hour, #Traoré vs Netanyahu was everywhere. Commentators called it the day the global south stood up. Inside the UN press hall, chaos reigned. Journalists rushed to the podium, shouting questions as Netanyahu's security detail shielded him from the flashing cameras. Prime Minister, do you deny bombing civilians? What is your response to President Traoré's accusation? He didn't answer. His face, once the image of defiance, now looked carved from stone. No comments, one aide muttered, pulling him away. Meanwhile, in another corner of the building, Traoré stood before a crowd of reporters, composed but fierce. What we witnessed today, he said, was not just a disagreement between two leaders. It was a confrontation between conscience and power, between those who believe bombs bring peace and those who know peace cannot grow on graves. The applause that followed was spontaneous, unplanned, and genuine. Reporters clapped. Some openly, others discreetly. It wasn't protocol, but it didn't matter. The moment had broken every rule of diplomacy. That evening, the footage of Traoré spread like wildfire. African youth filled social media with posts celebrating him as the voice of the voiceless. In Kenya, students projected his speech on the walls of their university. In Mali, a mural of him with the words, "We kneel to no empire," appeared overnight. Even in Europe and America, young activists began sharing his quotes, describing him as the man who spoke when others stayed silent. But not everyone was celebrating. Behind closed doors, Israeli and Western diplomats met in emergency sessions. "He's dangerous," one American official said. "He's shaping public opinion faster than we can contain it." Another added, "He's turning African solidarity into a weapon." Traoré was fully aware of the storm he had created. But that night, standing on the balcony of his hotel overlooking New York City, he looked calm. The lights of the city reflected on his face, a contrast of two worlds, one built on money and influence, the other on belief and resistance. "Let them talk," he told his aide quietly. "They control the media. We control the message." The aide hesitated. "Mr. President, you've made powerful enemies today." Traoré smiled faintly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "No," he said. "I reminded them that Africa is not afraid anymore." The next morning, headlines around the world split into two realities. Western media framed the clash as a diplomatic misunderstanding, while African and Middle Eastern outlets called it a moral reckoning at the UN. The divide was so sharp that even the algorithm struggled to contain it. Every feed, every comment section, every news broadcast was burning with the same question: had Traoré just exposed Netanyahu before the entire world? In Jerusalem, Netanyahu convened an emergency cabinet meeting. His ministers sat in silence as he replayed the footage of Traoré's calm defiance. "He's young," Netanyahu said, his voice low and deliberate. "But he understands power. And that makes him dangerous." He turned to his advisors. "We cannot let this narrative grow. Africa must remember who feeds it." That same day, anonymous sources leaked that Israel and several Western nations were preparing to review aid partnerships with Burkina Faso. It was an old move: use economics as punishment for pride. But this time, the world was watching too closely. The attempt to isolate Traoré only made him look stronger. In Ouagadougou, Traoré stood before a sea of citizens gathered in the capital square. Tens of thousands waved flags, chanting his name. "They think they can starve us into silence," he declared, his voice thundering across the crowd. "But we were born in hunger. We survived their wars. And we are still standing." The people roared in approval. Some wept. Some raised their fists. To them, Traoré wasn't just a president, he was the embodiment of Africa's unbroken will. Across the continent, leaders began to issue statements of support. Mali, Niger, and Guinea released a joint declaration condemning the weaponization of aid against sovereign nations. South Africa's foreign minister called Traoré the moral compass of a lost world. Even in countries where governments remained neutral, the people were not. The streets spoke louder than politics. In Washington, a senior State Department official sighed as he watched the protests. "We can't stop him," he admitted quietly. "He's not fighting with weapons. He's fighting with words." Meanwhile, in Tel Aviv, Netanyahu stared at a photo of Traoré on his desk. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, almost to himself, he muttered, "You want a war of words? You'll get one." But Traoré was already one step ahead. He called an emergency summit of African nations, not to condemn anyone, but to unite them. His message was clear: we will not trade silence for food, nor truth for money. That sentence alone became a rallying cry. Posters of his words flooded social media. In less than 48 hours, #AfricaWillNotKneel became the most trending tag in the world. As the old order scrambled to protect its image, one thing became clear: Traoré had changed the language of power itself. The summit hall in Ouagadougou vibrated with an energy no one could ignore. Delegates from more than 20 African nations filled the seats, some wearing traditional attire, others in Western suits, but all sharing the same look of quiet determination. In the center of the room stood Ibrahim Traoré, flanked by the flags of a continent that had too long been spoken for, never spoken by. "My brothers and sisters," Traoré began, his deep voice echoing through the hall. "For decades, they told us who our enemies were. They fed us their wars, their aid, their pity, and called it progress. But now the world has seen what they call peace. They saw children buried under rubble and still had the courage to call it defense. Today, we call it what it is, a crime against humanity." Thunderous applause erupted. Cameras broadcasted his words across Africa and beyond. For the first time in years, the African Union wasn't just a talking chamber, it was alive, electric, reborn. "We are not against the West," he continued, raising his hand for silence. "We are against hypocrisy. We are against those who think Africa should cry quietly while their bombs roar over Gaza." His statement ignited a firestorm online. African youth flooded social platforms with messages of solidarity for Palestine, but also of pride in their own identity. Memes of Traoré facing Netanyahu circulated with captions like, "The Lion of Africa roars back." Music artists sampled his speech, poets recited his words in the streets, and across the continent, murals of his face appeared overnight. In Washington and Tel Aviv, analysts scrambled to understand what was happening. "He's uniting them emotionally," one intelligence report read. "This is not about Gaza anymore, it's about dignity." Meanwhile, Traoré's message reached unexpected allies. Activists in Latin America, Asia, and even parts of Europe began quoting him. For the first time, a leader from one of the poorest countries in the world was shaping global discourse. Back in Burkina Faso, crowds gathered outside the presidential palace, waving torches and singing freedom songs that hadn't been heard since the days of Thomas Sankara. Traoré stood by the window, watching the sea of people, his reflection merging with the lights of the revolution outside. Marie, his advisor, entered quietly. "Sir, the Americans are demanding a statement. They want to know if your comments were directed at Israel or them." Traoré turned slowly, his eyes burning with conviction. "Tell them it was directed at anyone who forgot what humanity means." Marie smiled faintly. "Then that means everyone heard it right." That night, as Africa stood awake, unified not by power but by purpose, one thing became clear: the age of silence was over. By dawn, Traoré's speech had already crossed continents. In Paris, London, and Washington, diplomats huddled in late-night crisis meetings, staring at screens filled with millions of African flags and the same defiant quote repeated everywhere: "Africa will not kneel." It wasn't just rhetoric anymore, it was a movement. In Tel Aviv, Netanyahu's mood was volcanic. He slammed a folder onto the table. "He's turning Africa into a weapon. This man is poisoning global opinion against us." His intelligence chief hesitated before responding, "Sir, it's not just him. He's become a symbol. Silencing him now will only make him louder." Netanyahu's eyes narrowed. "Then we remind him who controls the world stage." That afternoon, Western media launched a coordinated narrative. Articles painted Traoré as a populist firebrand, a destabilizing figure, a pawn of anti-Western forces. But the plan backfired. African journalists fired back instantly, exposing the hypocrisy, posting headlines like, "When speaking truth becomes a threat." The internet had changed the rules. No single empire owned the truth anymore. In Burkina Faso, Traoré gathered his ministers in the war room. The walls were covered in maps, screens showing international broadcasts, and intelligence briefings from allies. "They'll come for us economically," warned the finance minister. "They'll sanction, isolate, and call us radicals." Traoré nodded, calm and unshaken. "Then we trade with those who respect us. We eat what we grow, build with our own hands, and survive as free people, not rich slaves." The room fell silent. Even the sound of the ceiling fan seemed distant. His words didn't sound like defiance, they sounded like destiny. Across Africa, his defiance spread faster than any sanction could reach. Ghana announced it was reviewing its diplomatic stance toward Israel. Senegal suspended a weapons contract. South African leaders quoted Traoré directly in parliament, saying, "The courage of one man has reminded us of our collective spine." But as his fame grew, so did the danger. Intelligence reports suggested covert operations targeting him. A few close allies urged him to tone down his speeches. "You've made too many enemies, Ibrahim," Marie warned. "They won't forgive a man who speaks this loudly." Traoré smiled faintly. "They fear words because they've lost their power to use them. Let them come. We were born surrounded by enemies, and still, here we stand." That evening, Traoré addressed his people once more. The streets of Ouagadougou glowed with torchlight. His voice thundered through loudspeakers. "They can call me dangerous. They can call me radical. But I will never stop calling them murderers when they bomb children and call it defense." The crowd erupted. The chant was deafening, "Traoré. Africa. Freedom." From that night on, one truth became undeniable: Ibrahim Traoré was no longer just the president of Burkina Faso. He was the heartbeat of a rising continent. 3 days after the summit, the atmosphere around Traoré shifted. The cheers in the streets of Ouagadougou still echoed, but behind the celebration lurked unease. Intelligence intercepts revealed encrypted communications between Western security agencies, and one name kept appearing: Project Silencer. In a dimly lit operations room somewhere in Europe, a group of officials reviewed satellite footage of Burkina Faso's presidential palace. "He's uniting Africa under one message," said a gray-haired man, his tone sharp. "If we don't contain him now, he'll dismantle 50 years of influence." Another officer replied coldly, "Contain him? You mean remove him?" The silence that followed was agreement. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, Traoré sat with Marie and General Ouedraogo. On the desk before them lay a classified report. It contained intercepted communications from a foreign embassy, vague threats hidden behind diplomatic language. "They're preparing something," said Marie quietly. "They call it a stabilization plan." Traoré leaned back, his expression unreadable. "They've tried everything: bribes, threats, propaganda. What's left? Poison? Drones?" He paused, then smiled grimly. "They still don't understand. You can kill a man, but not the idea he carries." Outside, the people's faith in their leader only grew stronger. Farmers painted his initials on their tractors. Students renamed schools after him. Even soldiers began wearing small badges with the words, "No kneeling." The symbol had become more powerful than any weapon. But not everyone inside the palace was loyal. Late that night, a man in a service uniform slipped through the back corridors carrying a silver tray. The security cameras caught his nervous glance. He placed the tray at the president's table, and disappeared. Moments later, Marie entered and noticed the untouched cup. Her instincts screamed. She called for the guards immediately. When the team arrived, they confirmed what she feared: the drink was laced with a toxin, a compound similar to the one used against Traoré months before. The president listened silently as they explained. Finally, he stood and looked out the window toward the flag waving in the wind. "They're desperate," he said softly. "They've lost the argument, so they've returned to poison." He turned back to his team. "Double the security. But tell no one. If the people smell fear, we lose what makes us strong." That night, under the heavy Burkinabe sky, Traoré sat alone, writing in his journal. His words were steady, deliberate. "They will come again, not for me, but for the voice that tells them they are small. I was born among those voices. I am only their echo. The moonlight fell across his desk. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. The same storm that once threatened to drown Africa was now trembling instead. The next morning, the capital woke under a bruised sky. Rain drummed against the palace windows like war drums, echoing the tension in the air. Traoré's intelligence unit confirmed what he already suspected: foreign operatives had entered Burkina Faso through neighboring borders, posing as aid workers and journalists. They weren't carrying cameras. They were carrying orders. Marie rushed into his office, her face pale. "Mr. President, we intercepted communication between the embassy in Accra and their field team. They mentioned a final step tonight." Traoré didn't flinch. "Then we make tonight theirs, not ours," he said quietly. He called for General Ouedraogo and the Inner Defense Council. Within minutes, the war room came alive. Maps lit up the walls. Drones began scanning border checkpoints. The army was ordered to full alert, but no announcement was made. "They expect chaos," Traoré said, his tone steady. "We'll give them silence. Silence makes predators nervous." As night fell, a convoy of black vehicles moved through the rain toward the outskirts of Ouagadougou. Inside one of them sat three men dressed in civilian clothes, speaking in clipped English. "Target isolated," one said into a headset. "We proceed at 2,300 hours." They didn't know they were being watched. 2 miles away, hidden in the darkness, Burkinabe special forces tracked every move. When the convoy stopped near the western wall of the presidential compound, the ambush began. Floodlights ignited. Gunfire shattered the night. Within seconds, the aid workers were pinned down. 2 were captured alive, 1 never made it out of the car. When the smoke cleared, Traoré arrived at the scene himself. Rain soaked his military jacket as he stepped toward the captives. "Who sent you?" he asked calmly. One of the men sneered through clenched teeth, "You won't make it to next month." Traoré crouched down to meet his eyes. Neither did the last empire that tried. The man fell silent. Hours later, Burkina Faso's security ministry released no statement. No news reports covered the event. But the story spread anyway, whispered by guards, passed between soldiers, carried into the streets like wind. They tried to kill Traoré again, and failed again. Across Africa, the legend grew. Children repeated his defiant words. Radio hosts replayed his old speeches with new meaning. And in the West, the silence of intelligence agencies spoke louder than any press release. At dawn, Traoré looked out from the palace balcony, his eyes fixed on the storm clearing over the city. "They keep coming," Marie said softly beside him. He nodded. "Because they don't understand what they're fighting anymore. They're not fighting a man, they're fighting a generation that refuses to kneel." The clouds broke open, sunlight spilling across the city like a promise. For the first time, even the rain seemed to stand still. The morning sun returned to Ouagadougou like a victory banner. The failed assassination had not been broadcast, but everyone knew. From the rice fields of Mali to the ports of Senegal, word spread in whispers that became chants. They tried to break him. He stood taller. In the presidential courtyard, Traoré met with his ministers. The faces around him showed both fatigue and awe. "They thought fear would silence us," he began, "but fear is their language, not ours. Our language is dignity." General Ouedraogo placed a report before him, details of the captured operatives. The documents inside linked them not only to foreign agencies but to regional collaborators, paid informants, politicians, and businessmen. "So," Traoré said, scanning the names, "our enemies weren't just outside our walls. Some were dining inside them." Marie frowned. "Should we expose them publicly?" Traoré closed the file and looked up. "Not yet. When you cut a snake, you don't announce it. You watch where the rest of the body hides." He rose, walking toward the window overlooking the courtyard where soldiers trained in the rising heat. Every generation of Africans faces a choice, he continued. To live quietly under someone else's system, or to die loudly building our own. A silence fell over the room, not out of fear, but reverence. Later that day, Traoré addressed the nation. Millions tuned in. His speech wasn't read from a paper, it came from somewhere deeper. They accuse us of defending terrorists, he said, his voice resonating through every radio and TV. But who are the real terrorists? Those who drop bombs on children and call it justice? Or those who pick up the pieces and call it survival? He paused, letting the words cut through the air like blades. They want to erase our voice because our voice reminds them of their crimes. But we will not whisper. Not for gold. Not for power. Not for mercy. Africa has been silent long enough. From this day on, silence will belong to them, not to us. The nation erupted. Crowds flooded the streets again, singing, waving flags, chanting his name. The same chant echoed through markets, universities, mosques, and churches alike, Africa will not kneel. From London to Tel Aviv, from Washington to Paris, analysts watched with dread. He's not a politician anymore, one diplomat whispered. He's an idea. And ideas don't die. That evening, Traoré stood alone on the balcony, gazing at the horizon lit by thousands of torches. Marie joined him quietly. You've changed everything, she said softly. He smiled faintly. No, Marie. Africa changed itself. I only reminded it how. Lightning flashed in the distance, not a threat, but a signal. The storm that once symbolized chaos had now become a herald of rebirth. As the chants below grew louder, one truth rose above all others: empires fall not when their enemies attack, but when their lies are finally answered. And on that night, Africa had answered.